Her hand trembled as she placed the porcelain cup back onto its saucer. The diner's lights reflected faintly in the silver spoon beside it, shaking as though it too shared her fear. No one noticed the way her eyes darted. No one except the man who leaned too close, his fingers wrapping too tightly around her thin wrist. His words were low, meant only for her ears, but they carried the weight of a threat that poisoned the air around her. The elderly woman did not cry out. She did not beg. Instead, she let her eyes travel across the room and rest on the only stranger who seemed to carry a different kind of gravity. Broad-shouldered, scarred in subtle ways, a man whose silence spoke louder than the chatter of the diner. At his side lay a German shepherd, watchful and still, its amber eyes sharp as flint. In that moment, the woman did the only thing she could think to do. She let her fingers brush the fork on the table, and then she set it upright, balanced unnaturally, an unspoken message in plain sight. A silent SOS, the Marine noticed. He had been trained to read signals, hand gestures, subtle glances, improvised cues from comrades pinned down in fire. He had seen desperate eyes like hers in villages, torn apart by war, civilians trying to cry for help without drawing more danger upon themselves. Now here in this ordinary diner, he felt the same electricity crawl down his spine. The fork was no accident. His name was Daniel Reyes, once a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. The uniform was gone, but the bearing remained, straight-backed, watchful, every muscle ready even in moments of rest. His German shepherd, Atlas, was more than a companion. Atlas had once been trained to find explosives and enemies hidden in shadows. Now in civilian life, the dog had become Daniel's shield against the ghosts of war. Daniel shifted his gaze, not abruptly, not enough to warn the man gripping the woman's wrist. He read the room, a diner filled with late-night travelers, truckers, families with tired children. Conversations continued, oblivious. But in the center of it all sat this woman, fragile yet unbroken, and a man whose presence reeked of quiet violence. The bystanders saw, of course they saw, but silence weighed on them, heavy and cowardly. Daniel knew that silence well. He had heard it after battles, when people turned their heads away from wounded men, when bureaucrats ignored the pleas of veterans who returned home broken. Silence was a weapon, sometimes sharper than a blade. The woman's hand twitched again, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though the smallest movement might shatter her fragile disguise. And Daniel thought of his mother, her hands just as worn, her eyes just as weary, and something deep inside him settled. He would not let this pass. Once long ago, Daniel had been 19 years old, staring out at a desert that seemed endless, the air shimmering with heat. He had felt the weight of his rifle, the weight of responsibility. He had buried comrades under skies too wide, skies that didn't care if men lived or died beneath them. He remembered promising a fallen brother he would make it home. He would carry his honor with him. He would never let fear dictate his choices again. But coming home had not been simple. Nights were restless. Crowds made him uneasy. Atlas had been the only constant, grounding him, protecting him when sleep pulled him into memories of explosions and screams. Now, sitting in this quiet diner, the promise he once made returned to him with force. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, even here, especially here. The man holding the woman's wrist finally leaned back, but not to let her go. His smirk curled with arrogance, as if daring anyone to notice, daring anyone to intervene. He whispered something, and her lips trembled with a reply too soft for the room to hear. But Daniel didn't need words. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way her pulse fluttered against paper-thin skin. Bystanders avoided looking. The waitress glanced, hesitated, then turned away with the coffee pot. The injustice burned hotter because of the silence. Daniel had learned painfully that when evil is ignored, it grows bold. Atlas stirred, his ears tilting forward. He had sensed Daniel's shift before Daniel even rose. The Marine did not storm across the diner. He did not need to. He stood with the kind of deliberate calm that drew attention without demanding it, every inch of him steady, collected. The chair's legs scraped the floor softly. But to Daniel it sounded like the beginning of a battle he had already chosen to fight. The man at the woman's side noticed. His eyes narrowed, measuring this new presence, a stranger, perhaps dangerous, but alone. Alone except for the German shepherd whose gaze cut across the space like a blade. The woman caught Daniel's eyes once more, and in that fleeting glance, trust was exchanged, silent, sacred, absolute. She did not know him, but she knew what kind of man he must be. Only those who have fought demons, whether foreign or within, carry themselves like that. The tension thickened. Forks froze mid-air, conversations stilled. People saw now. They couldn't deny it. The man's grip on the woman was obvious, his threat tangible, and yet still no one moved. Daniel approached with quiet authority. He said nothing. He let his silence speak, let his presence weigh heavier than the false bravado of a bully. Atlas padded alongside him, muscle coiled, steps light but deliberate. Every person in that diner felt the shift. The man sneered, but his hand twitched involuntarily, loosening for a fraction of a second. Daniel's eyes caught it, and he knew he had struck a nerve. He did not need to shout, did not need to brandish force. His calmness was his weapon. A phrase lived in Daniel's heart, a phrase once spoken to him by an old sergeant as they crouched under fire. Power doesn't always speak. Sometimes power is the silence that refuses to yield. And so Daniel stood before the table, still as stone, his shadow falling across both the man and the woman. The man's smirk faltered. For the first time, he realized he wasn't in control. The woman's fork toppled onto the table, her sauce complete. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice low, steady, deliberate. He didn't ask, he commanded. And in that moment, his words carried not just authority, but history. Every sacrifice, every battle, every fallen comrade behind them. The diner held its breath. People who had been cowards a moment ago now leaned forward, as though witnessing something ancient and unshakable. The man withdrew his hand, muttering something venomous, but his eyes betrayed him, fear replacing arrogance. Atlas growled, low and controlled, and that sound made the final decision for him. The man pushed his chair back, too quickly, knocking against the floor. He stumbled for the exit, glaring over his shoulder, but his power was gone. He left not with triumph, but disgrace. Silence followed, but this silence was different. It was the silence of relief, of awe, of respect unspoken but deeply felt. The woman exhaled, her frail shoulders trembling as tears welled in her eyes. She whispered a thank you, but Daniel shook his head gently. Some acts needed no thanks, sure. People rose slowly, some placing hands over their hearts, some nodding at the Marine in silent recognition. The waitress, her voice catching, whispered words meant for the entire diner, but especially for him. There are still good men in this world. Daniel's reply was quiet, but unforgettable. Sir, sacrifice doesn't end when the war is over. Some battles follow us home, and some we choose to fight so others don't have to. Those words lingered in the air, heavy and immortal. The woman reached for his hand, her frail fingers pressing against his calloused palm. She did not let go immediately, as though she drew strength from his steadiness. Atlas rested his head gently against her knee, a silent promise of protection. Around them the diner transformed. Strangers stood not in fear, but in solidarity. It wasn't loud applause, it wasn't cheering. It was something far stronger, a standing silence, a collective acknowledgement that they had witnessed dignity overpower cruelty. When Daniel finally returned to his seat, Atlas curling at his feet, the world seemed steadier. He picked up his coffee, now lukewarm, but it didn't matter. The woman was safe. The man was gone, and everyone in that diner had been reminded of something they had nearly forgotten. Silence can be the loudest weapon of all. Later, as the woman left with a relative who had come to pick her up, she looked back once more. Her eyes met Daniel's across the room, and in them was gratitude deeper than words could ever carry. For Daniel, it was not heroism, it was duty, a continuation of the vow he had made long ago under a desert sky. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. As the diner returned to its rhythm, conversations picked back up, but none of them were the same. Strangers carried home the story of what they had seen, a story they would repeat again and again, a Marine and his dog, an elderly woman's silent plea, and the quiet, unshakable dignity that restored justice without a single blow. And so the reflection lingers. In a world often loud with cruelty, there is a different kind of strength, the strength of silence that does not yield, the strength of sacrifice carried long after uniforms are folded away, the strength of ordinary moments that become extraordinary because someone chose to stand. Viewers across the world, where are you watching from tonight? Share your thoughts, share your stories of silent heroes who stood for what was right. And if this story stirred something within you, subscribe for more. Because the world needs to remember these moments, these acts, these people who prove that honor does not fade. Because sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that doesn't need to speak at all.